Good afternoon, and welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. I am Krista Worthington, Executive Secretary with the Michigan Department of Education. We promote and encourage teaching the rich and diverse history of our country and world. The presentation you will see today intends to provide educators additional perspectives, knowing that as educators expand their knowledge, they will better be able to create lessons that help students meaningfully engage with history. We are proud to partner with institutions of higher education, cultural centers, and the Confederation of Michigan Tribal Education Departments, bringing their research and expertise directly to Michigan educators. Today, we are fortunate to welcome Dr. Katie Chaka Parks, who will share the rich history related to women's experiences during the Holocaust. This webinar will share how the Holocaust was not gender neutral and will share how women experienced the Holocaust as women were targeted differently.
Teaching Comprehensive History. Teaching Comprehensive History webinars are intended to lift the knowledge of educators so that in turn you may provide opportunities for students to inquire, think critically, and explore history from multiple perspectives you may have not heard before. As you listen today, you are encouraged to consider how this content and perspective could be incorporated to enhance learning in your community. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Katie Chaka Parks, who holds a Ph.D. from Wayne State University. Katie is a Holocaust historian with a focus on women, gender, and sexuality in modern Germany during World War II and the Holocaust. Katie has also taught numerous courses and delivered keynote lectures on women's experiences during the Holocaust. As the manager of adult education at the Zekelman Holocaust Center, she leads and creates educational programming for adults and professionals focused on the history of the Holocaust and its implications today. She was a subject matter expert on the content writing team for the multi-million-dollar permanent exhibit redesign of the Zekelman Holocaust Center, where she incorporated her research on women's experiences. I'd like to welcome Dr. Chaka Parks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me today. Let me share my screen with you really quick. All right. Wonderful. So thank you again for that very kind introduction. As mentioned, we're going to be exploring today how women experience the Holocaust in unique and different ways, detailing how this vital information about women's stories actually helps us understand a much more holistic and rich understanding of the history of the Holocaust. As mentioned, my specialization is in women, gender, and sexuality during this period. And so this is a massive topic that we're certainly not going to be able to cover all of today. But I want all of you to know that as the only Holocaust museum in the state of Michigan, we are always here as a resource for you. You're welcome to reach out at any time, and helping teachers deal with this kind of difficult history, not only learning it, but relaying how to teach this in your classrooms is something that we are always here for you for and happy to help. So again, today our goal is really going to look at how women's experiences actually create a more complete and accurate history of the Holocaust. I want us to walk away with understanding some of the variety of ways that women experience the Holocaust, how women's history is really integral to understanding the entire story. That if you are only looking at men's experiences during the Holocaust, if you are only teaching male memoirs, if you are only following the general narrative, you are actually only teaching about men during the Holocaust. You are forgetting about 50% of the people that experience this history. And I think that diversity of experience is something that can really stand out to our students as well, something that they may not be able to personally relate to this history. They may not be Jewish. They may not have ever learned about the Holocaust before, but they can understand issues of gender, right? And helping them see that that is so integral to this history helps them see that it's integral in their own lives today in any historical period. So you can apply a lot of these lessons to other periods as well that you teach. Really looking a little bit in the beginning here, focusing on why women's stories were left out of the general narrative in the first place. And then again, throughout, helping us kind of go over how you can incorporate these different kinds of themes in your classroom in the ways that you see fit. So before we begin with a lot of the deeper content, I want us to take a really quick moment. This is an exercise that you can do with your students before you start this kind of a lesson. And I want you to think of a short story, a favorite memory, a favorite vacation. Note the people, the family, the friends, the places, any specifics about this story. Now, what if I told you that you had to tell that exact same story with no women in it? Right? Does your story even make sense? Do any of our histories, our stories, because that's what history is, they're personal stories, do any of them make sense if we don't include women? Right? Ignoring women does not help us understand our past or our present. And so the Holocaust has really become this prime example of the collection and transfer of memory, but also the use of historical memory as a tool to learn from the past to enact change in the present. And so when we consider this complicated history of the Holocaust, we're often drawn to the sheer magnitude of the million people that were murdered during this period. Each one of those 6 million people, something I want us to center on today, is that each of those people was an individual person with individual experiences and hopes and dreams and families and aspirations, all these things that were cut short because of immense hatred. So when we teach about the Holocaust, one of the guiding pedagogical principles has to be, you don't have to teach them everything. Right? Don't give them this massive history of the Holocaust. You can teach them the overarching history, but help them connect to it with personal stories. And so that's what we'll do today, kind of highlighting how you can do that with your students and how these personal stories, especially about women, can help challenge your students' ideas of preconceived notions of what women did in the past and how they operated in these spheres. We have to remember that when we discuss and illuminate these personal stories during the Holocaust, whose stories are we typically referencing, right? When we think of the Holocaust, even who committed these acts, they're typically male. We think of male survivors, male victims, male perpetrators. But if we don't give our students the opportunity to think about women in these spaces, then we are unfortunately doing a disservice and neglecting half of the people that experienced these horrific events. So again, this is just one type of activity that you can do with your students. Let them give a 2-minute story to their neighbor, have them switch, and then have them try to do it without including women. And I promise you that they will not be able to. So to begin, of course, it's always important to start with defining our terms. When we're talking about the Holocaust, we want to make sure that our students understand, that we understand that it was the systematic, bureaucratic, and state-sponsored murder and persecution of the Jewish people by Nazi Germany and their collaborators between 1933 and 1945, right? That's a really large definition, but what we really need to zero in on is that state-sponsored persecution, right? When we think of the Holocaust and the progression of hatred, it didn't always start in laws and legislation, right? It often started first with those interpersonal relationships, with people turning on their neighbors. And this is why helping your students understand and unpack that kind of a big definition will help them zero in on that individual responsibility, those individual choices right away from the beginning. It's for this very reason that it's important to also introduce gender at this point, right? There are historians Lenora Weitzman and Dahlia Ofer who very clearly state that questions of gender lead us to a richer and more finely nuanced understanding of the Holocaust. Because gender is a part of every single lived experience that we have. It colors how we understand our own world. Helping our students and ourselves understand that the Holocaust was not a gender-neutral event will help them be able to understand and digest this history better. So, of course, helping to explain why gender as an analytical framework for historical analysis is a very important place to start, right? So we start with the definition of gender. There are many different definitions. This is quite positively my favorite by historian Joan Scott, who defines gender as a constitutive element of social relationships based on perceived differences between the sexes. And gender is a primary way of signifying relationships of power, right? If I had a highlighter, it would be relationships of power, right? That's specifically why we have to analyze gender when we think about it. You know, during the Holocaust, people experienced the Holocaust in a variety of different ways, but gender is one massive category that we can zero in on and learn about a little bit more. So if this is true, then, right, if gender is such an important facet of history, we have to really ask ourselves, how did we get to a place where women's histories are ignored or erased in the dominant accounts of the Holocaust? So before we get into women's actual experiences, we're going to do a little bit of this historiography in the beginning here. Issues of power and gender within historical research first really became prevalent in the 1960s with the dawn of women's history in the United States. And the academic study of women's history really did not aim to rewrite history, right, as many of its critics feared. But the idea was to ask new questions to old answers, to readjust the lens with which we look at the past. And so some of the earliest feminist historians that were studying the Holocaust in this period were really concerned with women's stories being absorbed into that of the descriptions of male lives. And rightfully so, because this is exactly what happened. They were worried that the Holocaust would be boiled down into one description of a holistic event that everybody experienced the same way, completely ignoring that variety of difference. The first Holocaust museums began being built in the 1980s, 1990s, the freestanding ones, and their exhibits were informed largely by academic research, and yet they largely ignored women's experiences, again, more promoting this holistic understanding of the experience of all Jews, right? Read in the sarcasm and air quotes, absolutely. These critics of women's history at the time period argued that focusing on women's experiences detracted from the overall, more fundamental fact that the Holocaust happened to victims not as men, women, and children, but as Jews. And other critics also found, quite frankly, that talking about women's experiences can be uncomfortable. And people don't want to talk about uncomfortable things like the loss of menstruation or pregnancy or ending of pregnancy, sexual assault, rape. They don't often want to assume that women can be violent. We are taught again and again that these topics are uncomfortable, that they're taboo. But if we can talk about murder and dehumanization in terms of a genocide as large as the Holocaust, can we not also talk about women's issues? I want to be very clear. You are all experts in your classrooms. And so you know your students well. You know how they'll respond to certain material. So you need to be the one making those decisions in those spaces of what is safe for them to understand, for their well-being. And so today I'm going to give you a lot of information for our own learning as educators together that may be a bit difficult or uncomfortable, but I would challenge us to lean into the uncomfortable. We should be uncomfortable when we're learning about the Holocaust, right? But learning how to safely absorb that information as educators and then tailor that for the students in front of us. You are all experts on how to do that. And I think making sure that we can discuss the best ways, the safest ways to do that, to not only protect yourself and your emotional state, but your students, I think is something that's really important when you're studying something as difficult as the Holocaust. We have to really, again, move away from this understanding that everybody experienced things the same. Both men and women had a variety of different experiences, and all are valid and integral into understanding the history of the Holocaust, right? There are many different genders. You could do this presentation from many different viewpoints, and we're going to specifically just focus on women. I think the denial of difference does nothing to help us, not in the past, not in the future, to help future generations understand the significance of these events. And we cannot silence the stories and the voices of victims and survivors because of mere sexism. Mary Feldsteiner, a feminist historian in the field that was integral in this space, says here in this quote, along the stations towards extinction, each gender lived its own journey. So that's what we're going to be focusing on now. So we'll go back one here. So where to begin? We'll start in 1933 with Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party coming to power in Germany. Many people like to say that Hitler came to power, that he forcefully took over the government. That is absolutely not true. He came to power through legal means, right? Through a loophole in the Constitution. And so many people, older historiography, said that women voted for Hitler in disproportionate numbers. This is actually not true. Unfortunately, women and men both equally voted for Hitler in a very similar manner, not a landslide like people used to say. And this helped to propel Hitler and the Nazi Party into power. Women in Germany got the right to vote in 1919 at the end of World War I, largely because of their service and sacrifice during the war, not dissimilar to the United States. And they also, at this point, were really exploring new professional, social, economic roles. Think this interwar period, new woman with short hair, cabaret, right? This is all this period. And unfortunately, however, by the time Hitler and the Nazis come to power, these new sort of social shifts that women were experiencing in the public sphere of society instead of the private sphere of the home will be clearly tamped down upon, and not only tamped down upon, but legalized. There are so many women that at the time, even feminists at the time, believed that women and men should have separate spheres. Men can rule the social sphere of politics and society, and women can rule the home. And they thought, many of them, that they could put their faith in this party in order to be sort of rulers of their own domain of the domestic sphere. Please don't misunderstand me. There is no way that you can separate out the Jewish agenda, as it were called, from the way that these women thought, right? You could not vote for the Nazi Party and not know their views on Jews at the time, though of course they escalated and changed over time. But, there's even a speech that Hitler gives in 1935 where he states, and I quote, "In reality, the granting of so-called equal rights to women as demanded by Marxism does not confer equal rights at all, but constitutes the deprivation of rights, since they draw women into a zone where they can only be inferior. It places women in situations where they cannot strengthen their position with regard to men within society, but it only weakens them." Right? This is why you see that under the Nazi regime, the place of women is in the home. They are to be mothers and moralizers of the nation. And you can see that very clearly in this image here. This is a propaganda image that was used during the time, showing and depicting the perfect Aryan family, right? The mother and the child at the center of this family, with the eagle representing the state, engulfing the family, making procreation and reproduction at the center of politics, not the center of family, the center of politics, which means the government has a right to interfere in that. German women in Nazi Germany were encouraged to do their part to have more children for the state. There was a sort of idea that you could bear a child for the Führer, right? Führer being leader, Adolf Hitler, the term that he would be using later in his reign. Women were actually even awarded a military distinction based on the number of children that they had, right? Very pronatalist policies. This was called the Mother's Cross, which included a gold medal for having 7 or more children, a silver for those with 6, and a bronze for those with 5 children. Right? This was supposed to be, again, a military distinction. The way that you would salute men on the street for having their military uniform on, you would do the same if you saw this kind of medal on a woman. This is making this connection that men contribute by sacrificing on the battlefield for their country in a way that women contribute by sacrificing and creating children for the country. Again, very separate spheres. These, of course, were all ways that the Nazi regime tried to indoctrinate women, tried to ensure that they were ideal women that were loyal to the National Socialist regime, and focusing again on motherhood being integral to that space. What's interesting, though, is when we talk about women in Nazi Germany, which women are we talking about? Because everything I just said to you does not pertain to Jewish women. Right? When we think of Jewish women and their value to the state, the Nazis were not concerned with Jewish women having more children. It was quite frankly the opposite early in 1933. As things like birth control and abortions are banned in Nazi Germany for German women, Aryan women, they're still allowed for Jewish women. And you can see where some of this is going to be going, right? In relation to this too, there are also, again, this idea that women have been sort of hailed as mothers of the race, or in stark contrast, vilified as the ones guilty of rape and discrimination, right? This is a quote by Gisela Bach, specifically, again, targeting that these women were not welcome within social spheres, political spheres, cultural, really clearly showing that Jewish women were not considered to be welcome or helpful, we'll say, in Nazi Germany. Prior to the Nazi period, Jewish women were very integral within the feminist movement that was growing throughout Germany. There was one woman that specifically said, she quotes, "We were so German, we were so assimilated, we were so middle class," right? These are the refrains that people read over and over again to talk about women's lives before Nazi barbarism took over. Women during this period, they were social workers, they were women's rights advocates, Jewish women that were authors. These were women that were not just fighting for the emancipation of Jewish women, but of all women. They typically had smaller families, worked outside of the home, had more education. And so we can see that even with all of these attempts at emancipation of women, once Hitler and the Nazi Party come to power, they brought all attempts at Jewish and female emancipation to an abrupt end. Jewish women under the Nazi regime, of course, were targeted right away in 1933 for their reproductive abilities. And we can see this in the anti-Semitic legislation that targets them specifically. I think a lot of us typically use laws as a way to explain to our students how things got progressively worse in Germany. But do we look at those laws through a gendered lens? Because that in and of itself really helps us to see how women were attacked differently than men. Women, of course, beginning in 1933, are attacked under the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring. This was this law that was meant to clean up, quote unquote, the genetic gene pool that targeted individuals under the guise of different conditions, right? 9 conditions. Things like hereditary feeble-mindedness, schizophrenia, manic depressive disorder, hereditary epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, blindness, deafness, all of these things. People were unfortunately forcibly sterilized under the law because they were not a genetic help to the nation, right? This idea that if you ended somebody's ability to reproduce, that they could no longer harm the lifeblood of the nation, right? Again, lots of air quotes in here because this is all very challenging language that you should challenge your students to do textual reads of primary sources to be like, what is wrong with these words? Lifeblood of the nation, right? Those kinds of things. Women were disproportionately attacked under this law. Women that were feminists, women that were socially, sexually active, single mothers, women that worked outside of the home. Many of them were sterilized as a result under the guise of schizophrenia. We also see that there are roughly 5,000 people that die as a result of sterilizations, most of them women. Because when we think of this method that's being used, right, they're actually cutting their fallopian tubes. So this is a very, very violent measure that's being taken against women. And again, we don't typically think of these laws in that way. We think of the overarching nature of how they attacked women, but not necessarily in so specific terms. I think another treatment, of course, specifically of Jewish people and this anti-Semitic legislation is, of course, the Nuremberg laws of 1935. These are the single most damaging laws to the Jewish people because it did two fundamental things. For one, it stripped them of their citizenship. They are no longer citizens of Germany, right? People that had lived in Germany for generations, that spoke German, that again, they felt they were so assimilated, so German. These people are told that they are no longer citizens. They have no legal rights. Secondly, it classified the Jews as a race, right? Which is very distinctively different. And as a result of this, these laws are able to spur many, many other laws as a jumping off point, right? These are the legal foundation to genocide. Things like Jews aren't allowed to own bikes. Jews aren't allowed to go to the movie theater. Jews aren't allowed to eat out at formal restaurants. All of these things, shrinking their lives so that they couldn't be a part of public spaces, are a part of these laws. One of the Nuremberg laws, though, which is, again, something that you can do with your students, print out the Nuremberg laws, have them go through them and see what jumps out to them in terms of gender. For example, there's one in particular that says that it is unlawful for a Jewish person to employ an Aryan or domestic servant under the age of 45. Who works in domestic labor, right? Typically women. Why under the age of 45? Because they could potentially bear children, right? So these things that don't maybe on the surface seem like they're attacking women are very much doing so. And we have to ask ourselves, why do you think this was even part of the laws in the first place? We can also see how laws impacted people like those in this photo here. You can see this is a Jewish businessman. His name was Oscar Danker, and his girlfriend, who was a Christian woman. It is infuriating that in most of the accounts, she's called his girlfriend. Her name is Adele. And she and he are forced into public wearing these signs that say, "I am a pig," or "fit for the greatest swine and only mix with Jews," is what hers says. And his says, "As a young Jewish man, I only take young German girls to my room." Right? So clearly worried about this intermixing of race. And notice all of the people in this photo adhering to this ideology, right? The man in the back row behind Adele smiling, proud of this photo being taken, right? This unfortunately is just the beginning of what is to come. So again, as I mentioned in the beginning, we really want to highlight these personal stories to talk about how all of this impacted actual people. When we talk about these anti-Semitic laws being passed in Germany, targeting Jewish women as mothers and for the reproductive capacity or sexuality is very much something that happened quite frequently. But they also affected Jewish women across all spheres of social, economic, and political life, which really eroded, again, many of the gains that women had made in that interwar period. For example, this is, as you see on your screen here, Dr. Margaret Berendt. She was the first female lawyer in Prussia in 1925, and she opened her own law office in Berlin, and she had completed her doctoral studies in 1914, focusing on family law. However, after 1919, when women were allowed to take the bar, this is when her career really started to take off. And she wrote, as you see here in this quote, by 1933, the law firm had become the foundation of my livelihood. I had succeeded in establishing myself well enough to maintain my own office with an adequate income and was able to travel abroad repeatedly. I might want to add that I enjoyed trust, prestige, and growing recognition. I like that she says, "I might want to add," as if that part isn't as important. It equally is. She had pride in her work, in what she did, and she was forced to close her legal practice when the Nazis came to power. Luckily, she was able to escape Europe in late 1939 before the war, but she was only able to resume work as a lawyer in the United States after the war. So think of all that time that she lost in her profession, in her craft. And I think her story reminds us that women's experiences were not limited to the home, right? Both are equally important to remember, to present to our students, to constantly challenge those preconceived notions that they had of women at the time. But again, using these individual stories is one way that we can help our students grapple with the enormity of the Holocaust. Before perhaps even legal exclusion and discrimination, many women discuss the feeling of social exclusion during the Holocaust, these early years. One anonymous woman that I have their quote here, they said that they constantly would get together with their girlfriends of their hometown cafe once a month, right? Something that perhaps we all similarly do. And she said since the Nazis had came to power, she had not taken part in these kinds of gatherings anymore because she was worried. However, one day she saw one of her girlfriends and they convinced her that they should still meet up like they used to. And so you see on this quote here, she said, I was worried about my Christian friends, but I was also worried about myself. I knew I would observe them very carefully. I would notice even a shadow of their discomfort at my entry, but I didn't have to read their eyes or note a change in their tone. The empty table in the booth where we had always met spoke loudly and clearly, but I couldn't blame them. Why should they have risked the loss of their jobs only to prove to me that Jews could still have friends in Germany? I think that women in particular felt this kind of social exclusion because they were typically in that social sphere. They were more embedded in their communities in a way that men were not. Women were often forced to, of course, do some of the household duties. So many of them had more relations with people that were not Jewish than their male husbands that perhaps were more observant or had professions that were more closely tied to the community. Many of these people believe that, these economic hardships, children coming home from school saying what had happened to them for the first time with these horrible anti-Semitic events, women were the ones that were constantly fielding that discomfort first. They felt social exclusion through economic hardships, through having to make less expensive meals and clothing, fixing clothes for the family, all these ways that they used to have larger resources, but were constantly now shrinking as a result of their place in society. And I think we don't often talk about that social exclusion part because it is more difficult to perhaps nail down. But I think it is important for our students to understand that that was a very large element as well. Neighbors turning on neighbors. As we sort of continue this timeline of the history of the Holocaust, by 1938, the events of Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, that many of you are perhaps familiar with, seemed to many to be a very important turning point in policy towards the Jews. I always say that if you ask 5 historians, when did the Holocaust start? You're going to get 10 different answers, right? But I promise you, they're all going to tell you that Kristallnacht was a significant turning point in this narrative history. There was a wave of violent anti-Jewish pogroms on November 9th and 10th pogrom, meaning violent attacks of Jewish people. That's why you sometimes hear this event being referred to as the November pogrom. These took place all over Germany, annexed Austria, parts of the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia that had recently been occupied by German troops. And this was 2 nights of state-sponsored terror, right? Jews were attacked on the streets, in their homes, in their places of worship. 7,000 businesses and homes are damaged. 1,400 synagogues are burned, is the one that you can see in the image right in front of here. There are cemeteries and schools that are vandalized. Police are told, do not go put out anything or help any of the people having their property being destroyed unless this destruction is spreading to German properties, to German wealth. So again, people that were tasked to protect and serve were told to not do so in the case of the Jews. There were 100 people that were murdered during this event. And at the end of the events of Kristallnacht, 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and taken to the camps, the concentration camps. These stories of the men that were taken away are extremely important. And the way I just told you about the events of Kristallnacht are typically how we teach it. And then there's a period at the end and we move on to the next subject. But I really want to challenge us to understand, how did women experience Kristallnacht, right? If 30,000 men are rounded up and taken to the camps, what happens to 30,000 women? What happens to these families that are left behind to try to navigate this ever dangerous society? So while male testimonies often reference the night of broken glass, right, talking about the glass of the storefronts that were broken, women's testimonies often reference the night of flying feathers, because this is how women are attacked during Kristallnacht. Many of them are attacked within the home, right? I think this is a very powerful image that's not often referenced, right? Look at the sheer horror on this woman's face on the top right, that you see that her bedroom is broken into, right? This sanctity, this safe space is completely attacked during this event. And this was one of, again, the primary ways that women experienced Kristallnacht. Not to say that they didn't experience it in public as well or on the streets, but this is how many women remember it, right? The sexual violence and rape that occurred during these events is something that is often never discussed. But think of male soldiers breaking into these homes where women are primarily there, especially once word started to get out and men knew that they had to flee and run for their safety. Women are left in these spaces, and this is how gender, again, played a very integral role in these events. We can see too this idea of family heirlooms being destroyed, of women's space being invaded. This is something that I think is important to understand, and we can do so again through some of those personal stories. Ida Abraham is one woman that I would like to introduce you to, that you can see depicted here on this passport. She was one woman that experienced Kristallnacht, just one. But her one story can tell us so very much. She was from a small town of Frickhofen, Germany. She had a very comfortable upbringing where she learned how to sew from her grandmother. And her husband Albrecht welcomed a baby boy named Harry just a few months before the events of Kristallnacht took place. So 8 months later, on the night of Kristallnacht, there was a stone that was thrown through her window next to where their baby was sleeping, and her husband and her younger brother were away on business. And they were a part of those 30,000 men that were rounded up and taken to the camps. After the men were taken away, many women were left to be the sole providers for their families. This was extremely difficult since many people were purged from their professions starting in 1933, but women in many respects could still work in the domestic sphere. And so women had the very difficult role of how to provide for who was left behind. After these events, the SS in particular, one of the paramilitary organizations of the Nazi regime, put pressure specifically on the townspeople of Frickhofen, where she was from, to not only disassociate with the Jews, but to primarily deprive them of food. So Ida was terrified at how would she get milk for her young son, yet fortunately there was one non-Jewish woman in town who would sneak her milk. And I think it's often important for us to teach our students that it only takes one person to change the course of someone's life, right? The actions of this one woman that chose to do the right thing really impacted Ida's family's life and perhaps saved their lives. After these events, Ida worked tirelessly to get papers so that her husband and brother could get out of the camps. This was not something that's up to a certain point in the narrative of the timeline of the Holocaust was possible, right? But right after this period, people were still able to, if they would pledge that they would leave the country, they would let them out. And so she was able to get her family out to Shanghai because they had no visa requirements necessary to go there. We often hear our students and ourselves say things like, well, why didn't the Jews just leave? Which I would really question you to hear the victim blaming in that kind of a statement, because many Jews did try to leave, right? But there was also so many barriers to leaving, and immigration and redlining and immigration quotas was some of those reasons why people didn't leave. Her family was able to get out and go to Shanghai. And so once she had her husband and brother safe, she turned her sights to the rest of the family. She begged her parents to leave with her, but they would not go, right? Because her father was a World War I veteran, and quite frankly, he was a prominent figure in society and thought that they would be safe, right? People had no idea what was going to happen next. Eventually, she and her son Harry, that you can see depicted here much later in life, ended up going to Shanghai, and she brought her singer sewing machine with her, and she was able to still work and find work in a way that her husband and brother were not because of this domestic skill. After the war, they eventually applied for visas to come to the United States, and they came in 1947, eventually settling in Cleveland, Ohio. And so in all of these moves, Ida was able to provide for the family because of her domestic skills. And so for the next 30 years, she actually worked at Sears. She was in charge of the production of slipcovers, and she eventually died in 2003 at the age of 93 years old. I think Ida's story reminds us of how hard that women worked to keep the family together. She had so many barriers to her survival, barriers to immigration, but this was not uncommon, right? Many women were faced with similar challenges, and they used their place as women to help their families and others in the best they could, given the dire situation they were in. Along with people that could get out, right? Immigration. Marion Kaplan is one of the foremost historians that studies this, that was really a pioneer in looking at women's experiences during Kristallnacht. And she talks about how so many women sent their husbands, brothers, fathers out first because they didn't think that they would be attacked, right? Women didn't know that they should leave. They had no idea what was coming next. But after the events of Kristallnacht, many women continued again to hide out of fear of persecution. They had nowhere to go. Their homes were literally destroyed. And so some women did try to get out as well. This was, again, the most crucial task that was really confronting Jewish women, was how could we get our families to safety? There are roughly 78,000 Jews that immigrated directly after Kristallnacht. And even though, again, women are instrumental in these efforts, they often were not the ones to leave. One example, though, of a woman that did leave was this woman that you see depicted on the left here, named Ruth Korn. This is a story, an artifact that is local to our community here in Michigan. Ruth was originally from Germany, and she married her husband Mendel in Denmark in 1939, 1940. And they had their twin daughters that you see here, Miriam and Judith, that were born in 1940. And Ruth's cousin was a Detroit philanthropist, and he spared no expense or cost trying to get them out of Europe. In 1942, it cost $1,688 per person, that you can see on the left here, chronicling their journey and how expensive it was. This is about the equivalent to $27,500 today, right? This is extremely expensive. What family had that kind of money? So again, when we think of those barriers of leaving, money was one of them. And throughout this extremely difficult journey that the Korn family took, you see this basket that is depicted here. It's much larger in person if you come to the museum to see it. But this is how she traveled with her twin daughters. And, you know, anybody that's had children or seen children before in an airport, you know, I have my two toddlers in a cushy double stroller, and it's unbelievably difficult. And yet this is how this woman had to survive and travel to keep her family alive and keep them together. So an assessment of the events of Kristallnacht and this later immigration that people like the Korn family or the Abraham family took, it's important to look at how this gendered perspective sheds light on why it's so important to include these underrepresented narratives, right? If you only tell the male version of Kristallnacht, you miss so much of the historical record. It is incomplete without the addition of women's experiences. So now we're going to turn our attention to the ghetto system, which was created in 1939 after the invasion of Poland, right, with the start of World War II. This is a crucial step in the Nazi takeover to forcibly separate Jews from the surrounding population and forcing them into these designated ghettos with miserable conditions. I want to be very clear, the term ghetto originated in the Jewish quarter in Venice, Italy in the 1500s, when Venetian authorities compelled the city's Jews to live in one specific area. So this is not the way that we use the term ghetto colloquially in the United States today, but these ghettos of the Holocaust are walled off portions of cities where you cannot leave, right? Barbed wire, armed guards. But what I would challenge us to notice is the picture on the far right helps us see that while the Jews are on the bridge above, not able to walk on the same paths as Aryan people anymore, it is no secret what is happening to the Jews of Europe. Forcing so many people into these small areas was not a secret. The Warsaw Ghetto in Poland was the largest of the ghettos that had at one point over 450,000 Jewish people in a 1.3 square mile radius. It's astronomical to think about, right? Disease ran rampant. The plumbing couldn't handle that volume of people. Sometimes there was up to 15 people living in a room, not an apartment, a room. And so we see that the extreme exposure to disease and starvation and all of these horrific elements was certainly what was happening within the within the ghettos. And many people were forced to endure this. There were 600 ghettos in Poland alone. 90% of Jewry in Poland would then be murdered. And so you can see this direct connection. When we think of women's lives in the ghettos, though, we always have to challenge ourselves when we're learning about this history. If you learn about the ghettos, what did women experience? If you learn about the camps, what did women experience? Right? Constantly be asking yourself that question. Emanuel Ringelblum was a historian and social worker teacher who documented life inside the Warsaw Ghetto. And these are called Notes from the Warsaw Ghetto, which we'll get to more in a minute. But Ringelblum wrote right here, the historian of the future will have to devote a fitting chapter to the role of the Jewish woman during the war. It's thanks to the courage and endurance of our women that thousands of families have been able to endure these bitter times. Women in the ghettos of Eastern Europe often far outnumbered men, again, because men immigrated more frequently and earlier. Women endured the ghettos in different ways, right? Many of them were not allowed to be on official Jewish councils that helped to run the ghettos, but many of them were integral in their efforts with running soup kitchens. They were a vital response to the catastrophe unfolding around them, right? Zoe Voxman is a historian who talks in great deal about women's contributions to clandestine schools, various youth movements that they operated within the ghettos. And the Nazis ordered that Jewish women, again, be excluded from serving on these official committees, but so many of them served on housing committees, right? Organizing each building, negotiating evictions, helping obtain food, clothing for needy people, right? Women are working in the ghettos, and they are doing the best that they can to survive and resist at every possible point. There are, however, unique challenges for women within the ghettos that really start to come out in this stage of the Holocaust. This, of course, one of the main goals was not only to isolate the Jews during this period, but it was also to break down the Jewish family, right? The destruction of networks of support. Women, even still, were charged with maintaining family life and normalcy. For example, again, in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1941, Jews were prohibited from marrying and having children, right? A direct attack on the Jewish family. In Warsaw, in particular, in 41, pregnant women up to 3 months were forced to get abortions. And this is something that is intrinsically targeting women. This was similar in Vilna, in Kovno, in the Shvili Ghetto. There were children who were unable to contribute to a wartime economy, but they also signaled a Jewish future. And so all of that burden fell on women. Dr. Aaron Peretz, that you see his quote here, was a gynecologist in the Kovno Ghetto, and he specifically talks about how if you did not get an abortion and you were pregnant within the ghetto, it was a terrible sentence, right? The father, the mother, the infant would all be murdered. And so people were coming in by the hundreds to obtain abortions. And I think it's important to remember the conditions in the ghetto, right? How dirty it was in the ghetto, how unsterile, the great risk this came to mothers to even have this procedure, let alone the heartbreak that came with an unwanted abortion, right? All of these things were, excuse me, all of these things, women were uniquely tasked with trying to figure out how to survive. In Jewish law, one of the greatest values is given to the preservation of life. And so, however, when the life of an unborn child threatens the life of the mother, Jewish law dictates that the later be given preference, right? And allows for abortions in certain cases. And so there were rabbis in specific ghettos that would say that abortion was permissible without any medical indication to try to save women. But women were terrified of that this would perhaps result in permanent infertility, along with issues of fertility and abortions. Many women lost the ability to menstruate within the ghettos because of lack of caloric intake, many because of the sheer stress and trauma of the experiences around them. While many women maybe did not want to bear women in this harsh environment, then there's other women that wanted to conceive to fight back, just to prove that they could continue on regardless of what was happening to them. Women also became pregnant by mistake. And so we see that sexual assault and rape within the ghettos was also a part of many women's experiences. And it's among some of the most difficult content to talk about. Sexual violence occurred between Jewish men and women, and it also occurred between, of course, guards and Jewish women en masse by the perpetrators. There is a testimony by a woman named Golda Wasserman, and she describes the mass rape of 3,000 Jewish families that were settled within the ghetto, in the Tolkien ghetto. She talks about in the fall of 1942 that there, every 15 to 20 days, young women were selected for work. And these women were sent away from the ghetto under the pretense of working in a kitchen or a bakery or somewhere. And then they would come back returned, having been raped, ill with venereal diseases, and many committed suicide in the barracks, and some were killed when resisting, attempting to flee. So it's impossible, she says, to talk about what was happening in the ghetto, the desperate screams of these girls, the pleas of their parents. And this woman in particular, Golda Wasserman, ends her testimony by saying that she was sent to work. I think it's important for us to remember, again, that if you're not emotionally tied to this history, if we can't grapple with as educators how hard it is for us to process this information, let alone how hard it is to teach it, right? We're not robots as educators. We have emotions and pasts and experiences as well. And you have to take that into account when you're teaching this, right? You have to make sure that you're mentally safe as well, that you do everything you can to create space so that perhaps when you teach more difficult topics like this, you give yourself a little bit time after to recalibrate and process, and you give your students that same kind of courtesy as well. I used to be really embarrassed when I would give lectures in class or teach, and I would cry talking about this stuff or get teary-eyed as I am now. And I finally came to a place where if you're not emotional talking about this, I'm not going to be embarrassed about that. We should not, as educators, be embarrassed for caring, right? If you show your students that you care about these topics, it gives them permission to care about this too. And we're modeling empathy, right? That's what they're taking away from this. If that's all that our students get, and they don't even get the history of some of this, but they understand how to care about people that are different from themselves, experiences that are different from their own, I'm okay with that, right? I think that that is a big part of why we look at these experiences. And again, Give yourself permission to feel in that way and feel that these are difficult things to talk about. Much like Golda Wasserman's story, these are unfortunately not unique accounts, right? In Warsaw, it's documented by Jewish doctors that Germans suddenly would enter a house and rape 15 to 16-year-old girls right in front of their families, right? These are horrific acts that are taking place, and these are excruciatingly difficult topics. But if we're not talking about these experiences, we are watering down what these women experienced within the ghettos, right? We are doing a disservice to the victims, survivors, and everything in between. When we talk about women's experiences in the ghettos, escaping is one of them, right? These acts of resistance were very clear. And despite, again, these incomprehensible conditions, residents of the ghetto found ways to resist. They created schools and religious ceremonies, even though they were restricted in activities, they continued because they always found a way to survive. When we think about resistance and when we teach about resistance, we have to make sure that we're talking about a multiplicity of actions, right? There can be spiritual and cultural resistance that falls more into the expression of culture traditions, anything including like writing poetry, creating art, religious practice, keeping records, again, going to school, all those kinds of things fall into that category. Then you also see physical armed resistance, right? This is acts of opposition that are specifically violent, sabotaging of Nazi plans with weapons, all of these kinds of activities. It's very difficult to help students understand that resistance comes in many different shapes and sizes. But using a story like Genia Yudsky, which we're going to look at right now, I think is one way that you can help your students understand that resistance is more than just physically fighting back. Genia and her husband Bronek and their son Michal were incarcerated in the Sosnowiec ghetto in Poland. And in August of 1943, the ghetto was liquidated, her husband was murdered, and her son managed to flee to the Aryan side of the city. She was able to obtain ID cards for them both because she had fluency in both German and French, because she was a graduate of the Sorbonne University in Paris. So again, that alone will help to challenge. Women were educated this time. She spoke multiple languages. She used her wits to get out, right? In her desperation, she actually ended up turning her son, Michal, over to the care of a Polish woman named Branja. And one of the resources that you have sort of in your toolkit that go along with this webinar is the actual letters, the translation of the letters that she sent to both Branja and her son. And I mean, it's heartbreaking, right? She is saying to this woman that she doesn't know, take care of my child. And she's saying to her son, be good, take care of yourself, do as she says, right? That is resistance, right? This woman broke laws. She escaped captivity. She obtained false documents. If you would insert her name and a male name into hers, there would be no question that's resistance, right? But often what women like Genia did under the sort of auspice of motherhood isn't read as resistance, and yet it absolutely is. You can ask your students questions when they read these primary sources. How was she acting to resist Nazi destruction, right? What do these letters show us about her motivation to resist? Are you surprised about this being categorized as an act of resistance? And why? Why are you surprised, right? Helping them challenge those preconceived notions they may have. Her actions to save her son were absolutely heroic. Even though both of them were discovered, they were sent to Auschwitz together, and they were murdered there. These are stories that need to be told, right? Stories of mothers trying to save their children that would risk everything like any loving parent would do. This is resistance, and this is what we also need to discuss in terms of the story of women during the Holocaust. There are also non-Jewish women that helped to resist and fight back during this period. This is an image of Irina Zendler, whom you have perhaps heard of before. Zendler was a Polish social worker, a very young woman who worked with the underground resistance in Poland, Jagoda, and to save almost 2,500 children from the Warsaw Ghetto, right? She would work with Jewish families, having false documents created so that these children could be smuggled out of the ghetto and placed with Aryan families on the other side. She would write down the children's real name and identity, their parents' name, any information she had, and put it into bottles and bury them under a tree outside of the ghetto in the hopes that after the war, these children would be reunited with their families. Unfortunately, most of these children never saw their families again as they were murdered in Treblinka, which was one of the death camps of the Holocaust. She was tortured at one point. Her legs were broken, her feet fractured, and yet she continued doing this work, not because she thought that she was some saint, but because she thought that, as you can see on the quote here, I was taught that if you see somebody that's drowning, right, you jump into the water and you save them. You do what is right, no matter how much wrong is around you. And Irina Zendler is recognized as one of the righteous among the nations, which is a classification that's given to non-Jewish people that helped Jews during the Holocaust to no benefit of themselves. There's an entire database through Yad Vashem, which is the main Holocaust memorial in Israel, and you can look up stories of the righteous among the nation. And I encourage you to have your students look through this database of over 24,000 people and read how these people tried to help others. In order to get this designation among the nations, you have to have immaculate documentation, right? You have to have firsthand accounts, you have to have some sort of written evidence, all of these different kinds of things. And this is a great honor that people like Irina Zendler were given. I had somebody say to me once that they were surprised that there are slightly more women than men that are inducted into the righteous among the nations. And I have to tell you, I'm not surprised at all. I am not surprised that women who understood the place of being second-class citizens would understand and go out of their way to help other people. That does not surprise me, right? And yet, her story, she didn't tell it until so much later in life because she didn't think that it was quite miraculous or heroic. There is a book called Life in a Jar by Jack Meyer that was written about Irina Zendler specifically, and Zendler lived until 2008 when she was 98 years old. These acts of resistance by Jewish people during the Holocaust varied by condition, by year, by place, by if they were non-Jewish, like Irina Zendler, if they were Jewish, like Gina Yudsky, and depending on all of these very, very different factors, enabled people to be able to resist in different ways. Women, however, played a large role in resistance activities in and around the ghetto throughout the entirety of the Holocaust. They were integral to resistance spaces. And many people don't realize that from the beginning of the war, female couriers, people that were sending information, resources back and forth between ghetto to ghetto, were considered like the lifeline to Jewish communities throughout Europe. The majority of these young women were, they did not look stereotypically Jewish, and so they were able to live in plain sight, right? Again, transporting things like forged documents, money, information. They were ultimately the ones that informed the Jews in the ghettos of the mass murder of Jews during the Holocaust, was these young women. They were integral to both spiritual and armed resistance during the Holocaust. Similar to these couriers that are taking information to all of these different ghettos, helping to share what they could with who they could, women also participated in partisan groups that actively fought the Nazis through force that you see in these images here. During World War II, there were approximately 30,000 Jews who escaped ghettos and work camps and formed these organized arms resistance groups to fight the Nazis. There's a Jewish partisan educational foundation that has amazing resources if you're ever interested in looking further into this topic. But despite the odds, women were able to join the partisans. We do not often think of women as physically fighting back, and yet they did. And not only did they fight back, they did domestic duties for the partisan groups, such as cleaning, cooking, nursing, reconnaissance, women's transport, weapons transport, as well as armed combat, right? They made up 10% of the partisans. One of the quotes that's featured in the Jewish Partisans Archive is, despite the twin evils of anti-Semitic and sexist violence that threatened their survival, Jewish women partisans overcame the specific and compounded dangers they faced, both as women and as Jews. Helping our students understand the intersections of identity, that they weren't just Jews, they were also women. And that meant something different when you were in the forest fighting with your life. Maybe being the only woman in an all-male unit was physically dangerous for women, and yet they did it. And they recall their activities with fierce pride. There's one Greek partisan, a woman named Sarah Fortis, who said, "Fear was not in my dictionary." Right? Their boldness was remarkable, given that they were women that were not readily welcome into these male-dominated units. And she said that at one point, guns were the law of the forest and guns belonged to men, right? They understood that duality of sexism and racism that was happening to them. You can actually even see in the image on the left here, the woman on the bottom right, her name is Faye Schulman, and she was a partisan who was also a photographer that recorded a significant amount of the partisan activities. But I think that this is also an amazing image to use in your classroom to help students challenge those preconceived notions of what a fighter looks like. She is in a full, like, cheetah fur ensemble, for lack of a better word, right? With this hat and this chic coat and an assault rifle in her hand, right? She was a woman that was fighting for her life, for the life of others around her. And regardless of all of this immense fighting and resistance that happened, people like the partisans, like the couriers, unfortunately, many of them were still sent to concentration and death camps. That doesn't mean that their sacrifices were for nothing, right? They gave significant hope to Jewish people that they had a chance of survival. And this is what women helps to perpetuate as well. Getting sort of to the end of the timeline of our narrative here, there were thousands of concentration camps and sites of incarceration that were set up by the Nazis and their collaborators during the Holocaust. Roughly 44,000 sites of incarceration. I'm talking ghettos, transit camps, labor camps, the concentration camps, death camps, in between. There, of course, were only 6 extermination camps, though, all on Polish soil. In the United States, we call everything a concentration camp, and yet the experiences of people in these different types of places were very different, right? Unfortunately, the goal of a concentration camp and a death camp were quite similar, right? The end goal would be to murder the people inside. In a concentration camp, though, this was much more of a labor camp, where you can see women on the right here doing forced labor. At a death camp, the idea was that you would be murdered within a matter of hours of entering the camp. So these experiences were different, and I think it's important to help your students understand these nuances of language as well, so that they understand how important it is that it's very different to use those kinds of terms because of the experiences of the people inside. Every single camp was different, right? The same orders were given to everyone, right? To carry out this expulsion of the Jewish people. And yet it was carried out in so many different ways. All of these camps decided in different ways how to actually implement this final solution, as it were called, right? The final solution to the Jewish problem. This is very perpetrator language, talking about the extermination of the Jewish people. The reason I highlight that all of these camps are different is because it helps underline that people had choices. People made individual choices in all of these different spaces on how they thought that they should carry out these orders. And at any point, they could have made different ones. Concentration camps, these prisoners endured cruel treatment, to say the very least, lack of sufficient food, poor living conditions, brutal labor forces, and episodes of outright murder that led to an extremely high death rate within many of the camps, most of the camps. At the killing centers, Nazi officials employed these assembly line methods to murder Jewish people. These are at these, again, 6 main camps of Auschwitz, Chelmno, Majdanek, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. And German SS and police murdered nearly 2,700,000 Jews in these killing centers by poisonous gas, by shooting, and burning their bodies in the crematorium that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with when we think of this horrific history of the Holocaust. Much like when we learned about the ghettos, it's important to understand this overarching narrative and history of the camps, but also of the unique challenges that women faced in these spaces. As we know, both women and men were subject to life and death in the camps, and they faced unique challenges, women, because they were women. It was no happenstance. For many women, similar challenges to life that we discussed again in the context of the ghettos continued into camp life. Things like menstruation. Women had many worries in the camps, not surprisingly, that revolved around reproductive functions. Therefore, they were concerned with menstruation. Many women, again, suffered the loss of menstruation in the camps due to low caloric intake as well as shock. There are some accounts also of women being forced to inject a tar-like liquid substance that aimed at mass sterilization of female prisoners. There are women who still menstruated within the camps and yet had to suffer the shame of bleeding in public, the discomfort of dealing with it, since prisoners were not given undergarments or menstruation rags of any kind. However, this discomfort also did lead to female solidarity within the camps. Many older women had to explain to younger women for the first time what was happening to them, and people even helped others acquire strips of fabric and rags, even sharing whenever necessary, right? Some survivors said that that fabric was like gold within the camps. We also have, of course, this continued element of sexual violence against women within the camps that we've unfortunately discussed many times. With regard to menstruation, this was also known often to save women from rape within the camps, or save them for at least a certain period of time. Survivors recount horrific stories of almost being raped, and then their attacker realizes that they're bleeding and they consider them to be dirty and stop. As if menstruation is dirty and rape is not, right? This is how we have to have our children understand these difficult topics. You might not explain it to them in that very graphic way that I did, but they need to know that women were attacked differently for these very real reasons. In various camps, sexual violence was used as a way to torture inmates, both male and female. And there are examples of prisoners also being raped by camp guards, many of which were then murdered afterwards. We also hear of the experience of gay and lesbian people within the camps, women, because lesbians were not targeted under the law in Germany. Many people believed that they were not attacked by the Nazi regime in the same way. And yet often lesbians were the first ones to be sent to brothels that were in the camps to be rehabilitated, right? So we have to make these connections to gender, to sexuality, to show those intersections. Shaving of hair, of course, is something that we know happened when prisoners entered the camps. You can see the women in the image in the middle, that many of their heads are shaved. And while this is something that all prisoners experienced, women being shaved was particularly violent. And you should read hair being shaved of women as sexual violence and rape. These women, their private areas, vaginal areas were shaved. They had to endure vaginal examinations, which again, read the word rape into that space. as they entered into these camps as just another way of intimidating them, of harming them. And women, of course, also had to then worry about pregnancy, right? Pregnancy was a unique concern for women within the camps. Women who entered the camps with a with pregnancies or with small children, it was often considered a death sentence, right? Because they couldn't be used for labor, so they would be immediately sent to the gas chambers. In some cases, there are older women that realized what was happening, that offered to take their grandchildren to give their daughters a chance to survive. Their daughters often not realizing that their mother and child were being sent to the gas chambers. There are also other harrowing stories of women who found out that they were pregnant upon entering a camp, and women within the barracks would take turns trading uniforms so that the woman that was pregnant could get the biggest uniform as she grew. In many cases, these pregnancies ended in abortions or birthing of children and then having to murder those children in order for these women to survive. These are horrific things that no person should ever be challenged with, these kind of choices, right? Is that even a choice at the end of the day? I'm not sure that we can answer that question. Some Holocaust scholars call it a choiceless choice. I think in some respects that takes away agency of the women themselves and the difficult things that they had to endure and choices they had to make. But on the other hand, I understand that they're between a rock and a rock, right? There is no good choice. There are, however, individual people that helped the best they could with these unique challenges of women within the camps. Issues of reproduction and women's health were clearly paramount during the Holocaust, especially in these spaces of incarceration. And the direct persecution of the Jews and other groups of people would not be possible without the coordination of certain sectors of society, and the medical community was one of them. And yet we have to understand that even as Jewish doctors are expelled from being able to work on Jewish patients or non-Jewish patients in Germany, this didn't mean that Jewish professionals stopped helping people. And Gisela Perl is an amazing example of this. Dr. Gisela Perl was a woman who was from Sziget, Hungary. She came from a very loving family. She spoke multiple different languages, and eventually she became a doctor specializing in gynecology. She was imprisoned in Auschwitz-Birkenau with the infamous Dr. Joseph Mengele, who was informed about her specialization and she was told to report to him all the pregnant women within the camp. She understood very clearly that these women were marked for death. And so Dr. Pearl did her best to hide them if possible, perform abortions under the cover of night, or quietly deliver and then kill newborn children so that these women could have a chance to survive, so that they might live to have another child another day. She had to take her skills as a healer, as a bringer of life, to invert them so that she could still heal and help women the best she could, given the conditions that she was under. There are so many women that were concerned with these kinds of issues. Historian Lillian Kramer argues that in addition to the fear of becoming infertile, prisoners' uncertainty over whether their fertility would return after they were freed. She calls this a dual psychological assault on women. And people like Dr. Gisela Perl helped them navigate that space, even as she was enduring this horror as an inmate. One inmate later testified at the Conference of Jewish Material Claims against Germany, saying, "Without Dr. Pearl's medical knowledge and willingness to risk her life by helping us, it would have been impossible to know what would have happened to me and many other female prisoners." She was the doctor of the Jews. I think it's really amazing, though, because on April 14th of 1945, she was in Bergen-Belsen camp, concentration camp at this point. And as the camp was being liberated, she was actually able to deliver the first baby that was able to live in that camp. Her memoir that you see here on the right was published in 1948. I was a doctor in Auschwitz, 1948. This was the first published account of the Holocaust to attest to the reproductive and sexual horrors inflicted on female prisoners. And yet, even though it's published almost instantly after liberation, unfortunately, we don't still widely know her story and these stories today, which is why I think it's so, so paramount that we tell these. When we think of concentration camps, the horrors that are intrinsic to women, Ravensbrück concentration camp is a good spotlight that you can use to help your students learn about this. Ravensbrück was an all-female camp. It was made specifically for female inmates, but all of the guards of the camp, except for the commandant, the very highest, were also women. And so when we think about female perpetration, we often don't think of women being violent in this way, and yet they were. Of the camp guards, 10% of all guards during the Holocaust were women. And so looking at a place like Ravensbrück, that was just 50 miles outside of Berlin in a very populated area that was meant specifically for imprisoning women, we can get a little bit deeper at some of this perpetration and also experience of women in the camps. Wendy Lauer wrote a very important work called Hitler's Furies, and she gives us, I think, a really interesting understanding of why we don't attribute violence. She says, to assume that violence is not a feminine characteristic and that women are not capable of mass murder has obvious appeal. It allows for hope that at least half the human race will not devour the other, that it will protect children and so safeguard the future. But minimizing the violent behavior of women creates a false shield against a more direct confrontation with genocide and its disconcerting realities. We have to ask ourselves, why did women become perpetrators? Because of the same reasons that men did, right? Because of ideological conviction. It also, these roles gave them more money, more prestige in society. All of these factors come into play with how they were able to view other people as less than human and how they were able to do what they did to other people. One of those people was a woman named Irma Gries. She was one of the most infamous guards in the camps. She was nicknamed by prisoners the beautiful beast or the angel of death for how youthful and beautiful she supposedly was. She came from a lower class agricultural family, had no college education when she decided to volunteer as a camp guard. She would later testify that she was conscripted, which was a lie. But at 19 years old, she became a guard. When she was transferred to Auschwitz, she rose to the rank of a senior SS supervisor, approximately overseeing 30,000 female prisoners. This was the second highest rank that any female could have within the concentration camp personnel in the system. And Grisa worked primarily in Ravensbrück, in Bergen-Belsen, and in Auschwitz, and she became known for her sexual deviancy and taking SS male lovers in the camps while raping female prisoners in front of them. I mean, she claimed that she did not join for anti-Semitic reasons, and yet she obviously and absolutely did. She later testified and survivors testified to her pure acts of sadism, of beatings, of murdering people, thousands of people per day. And while this is the extreme end of female perpetration, women also supported the Nazi regime in a variety of other seemingly mundane ways that also helped to perpetuate genocide. So when we talk about women, we have to talk about the experience of the survivors, of the victims, but it should also be a place reserved to talk about perpetrators so that people understand that just because of your gender or sex does not preclude you from making these terrible decisions. Wendy Lauer, again, I quoted before, talked about how there are roughly 500,000 women that can be attributed in areas of teaching and social work and medicine, nursing, all of these areas that also help to aid in genocide. And I think it's a good reminder that, again, when we study the female agency during the Holocaust, we need to study their actions both as victims and as perpetrators, because it helps us at this more holistic story. While there was female perpetration, the campus always resistance. Not only resistance like Dr. Pearl's, but also resistance in mutual aid. This image shows you an image of the Ravensbrück cookbook, which was a cookbook that inmates created very secretly. Of course, this would have been completely dangerous to do. And they wrote down recipes. not just because they were hungry, but because they connected them to their culture, their past. When you perform and cook based on your family recipe, you think of the person and the people and the life that you had before. And this is what they were preserving in the camps. There are many historians that believe that women actually fared far better in the camps because they were able to rely on mutual assistance, because they were used to those kind of communal mutual assistance programs before the war. When we think about their contributions and how this helped them survive, one last example I'd like to discuss today tells us about how women survived after the war too. Because just because World War II ended does not mean that the Holocaust, that the trauma they experienced was just over. And so what you see here is a very small artifact of a lipstick tube. And in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, in the DP camp, the displaced persons camp that was created after the war, there was a shipment of lipstick that was returned, sent to the camp. And the lieutenant colonel, you can see his quote in his diary here, was furious originally because he thought these women, these people don't need lipstick, they need food, they need medicine. And yet he says that this lipstick started to give these women back their humanity. After all they had endured and experienced, this lipstick, not because it was makeup and women like makeup, it was because it helped them become individuals again after everything that they had endured. And I think this is just one example, again, of how you can say so much about one small artifact and help analyze the importance of gender in that for your students. There are millions of stories that you can talk about when you talk about women in the Holocaust, and we just glazed over so few, right? But that is the point. It's so difficult even narrowing down who you want to talk about, who I wanted to talk about today, because their stories are everywhere. They're accessible, and they should not just be a footnote in the history of the Holocaust, right? Their stories should be taught in schools, university classes, in museums, and part of the main narrative of the Holocaust. It is not a separate thing. It's not the Holocaust and then women in the Holocaust. It is the Holocaust. Because when we teach about women's history, it benefits everyone. Women's history is history. And so it's so necessary to study this past so that we can understand its implications on our present today. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, Dr. Chaka Parks. Your work is really important to Michigan educators and leaders as it provides a support to teaching comprehensive history within our classrooms. We sincerely appreciate your helping us to learn more deeply about women's experiences during the Holocaust.